Hey everybody, welcome back. Chalkboard History, volume, I don't even remember what it is. It's 3 or 4 or something like that. We are here today with Kristi Farrow, whose title is?
The Director of African and African American History with the Battle of Franklin Trust.
Well, we're not going to talk about just black people today. We're going to talk about a lot of white people and a lot of black people, but what we're really going to do, sort of self-indulgent, we're going to talk about a new book that is being written that's coming out, I guess probably next year. So I don't think it's a secret. I'm finally working on another book. And we're going to talk about some of the really interesting research that we have done over the last, it's been at least 2 years.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So, this all really focuses, well, it started with the Chairs family.
Yep.
It started with the Chairs family. It started with Rippa Villa because I was of the thought, as we went through the first couple of years of managing here, that there was a lot about the site, there was a lot about the family that, frankly, I didn't know, and that I think a lot of the people who visited had never heard, and anyone who'd read anything about it hadn't they didn't know about it. So I started with land deeds because I was trying to figure out like what the boundaries of the site were. And then it was like Pandora's box. It just exploded and, it took me in 15 different directions and I had you pulling deeds and I was like, okay, this makes sense. And I was trying to figure out like the difference, the boundary between Nat Chairs and his brother Martin. And then I started to learn about the other brother, John Chairs. And then I was like, oh my God, I have to write a book. So let's start with that early research, like what we were doing with the land deeds and like what was it like for you as you were digging through both online, but you were down at the Murray County Archives, so lead us into it.
Well, the land deeds, they're confusing as heck. I get lost in parking lots, so to have the deeds, you had to teach me how to actually find the deeds because you have to follow them back, and then you get back so far, and then you have to go strictly on years and people. It's incredibly difficult.
Oh, so it's like, the whole chain of things where you just keep going backwards?
Keep going back and keep going back. And you can sit there. And you can sit there for, all day long, which I was. 3 weeks in a row, I went down to the Murray County Archives at least 4 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And sat there, and we have thousands of deeds. I mean, we're over between probably 1,000 and 2,000.
You know what I think I learned early in this process that I didn't consciously know it, but I became aware of that there's something very, very unique about the United States in how we keep records. As we went back to these deeds, that some of them date to Murray County's created in 1807. So we were finding deeds from 1807 and 1808 and 1809. It is remarkable the kind of record keeping that existed from the moment the country was created. Like we just think all of a sudden this thing just exploded, and there was liberty and there was freedom and there was the United States. There's really an incredible thing going on state to state, county to county, town to town, person to person, where they're recording all of these things. And I learned that with Nathaniel Chairs and his family coming here and the original 300 acres they got in 1811. But that was just like the beginning of it. So we started looking at the land deeds. What was one of the moments where you realized that we were doing something that was probably not just looking for land deeds?
Honestly, when you actually put it on a map for me, when you were at your computer and you showed me one land deed and then you connected it to the other, and then you connected that to the other.
Oh, I was playing with Google Earth.
Yeah, and you started, because I didn't see it before that. Deeds are not my favorite thing. Deeds are a little dry most of the time. You don't get a lot of info, and it's like an oak tree to this, and you have a really clear way of seeing that, like on a battlefield, like maneuvers, and I don't. So when you put it on a map, and I was standing there, and I saw you drawing the boundaries, and when you started drawing the boundaries, it's like, oh my gosh, this is, like watching the property grow and expand. And then when you showed me like modern day where that would be, that was amazing, because then I was able to take that, like even when I was giving the tours, because tours here have always been really hard for me, and making people understand that this family owned, like, all the way up past Target. You know, like a cousin's brothers, Nat, grandparents, you know, all of that.
Yeah, just so like if
incredible.
if you're familiar with this area, I mean, you live in Spring Hill or you visited Rippa Villa, it is pretty remarkable that between the two Chairs brothers, Martin and Nat, they own basically everything from Duplex Road to about Denning Lane, west to Columbia Pike, and east to Kedron Road. I mean, they owned just an immense amount of property. But that was only the beginning. So we were pulling deeds over decades. So we were pulling deeds from Nathaniel, the father. Then we were pulling deeds from Nat, the son. Then we were pulling deeds that involved Martin. Then we were pulling deeds from John Chairs. I also learned something, and Mike Hoover, who is a great historian, lives here locally, has done tons of research. Mike and I got to talking about Henry Wade. Like, if you're in Franklin, everybody's heard of Abram Murray. He's like the town founder, right? Henry Wade is the dude who essentially created Spring Hill. And I didn't learn this until later on, that the Chairs owned these vast tracts of land and were essentially farmers, huge slave owners, right? There is a community here for about 20 years that doesn't really have a name. It's not Spring Hill early on. That name doesn't even show up until years later. Like, remember when we found that they were going to call the city Petersburg after James Peters? But it's really Henry Wade, because what Wade did was he'd bought this big tract of land, and what did he start doing? He started selling town lots. And
is that sort of like subdividing it?
Yeah, he bought this big tract of land, and then he was just bopping off like an acre, 2 acres, 5 acres. And then you start to see like a who's who of Spring Hill, because you start to see the doctors show up and the merchants show up. John Chairs bought land from Henry Wade. And then Martin Chairs got the bulk of the property that he lived on, because Wade ended up in all sorts of financial troubles. But talk a little bit about when we started to realize that this was something way beyond Tennessee. Do you remember when that happened? Like when we went, wait a second.
Well, the Campbells, they were always periphery, because I know you love land deeds, but I love people. And
Right.
I started like going in, and we kept seeing that there was this collection in Missouri.
And did Gilbert Chairs lead you there?
No, actually, I was looking at Louisa, and I thought, oh, that's really cool.
Okay, and Louisa is Nat's sister.
Yeah, Louisa's Nat's sister.
So let's go back just for a second. So we started with Nathaniel Chairs. He's sort of like Moses, right? And then he has all these kids, and we focused in on all of his sons and daughters. So you had Nat, Martin, John, Louisa, Nancy, and Thomas. So those were the ones we drilled down on.
And they all sort of went in different directions. Like the oldest sister went to Mississippi, Scott, who married Nathaniel Scott. And then we have one sister who went to Arkansas, which is Nancy, but she was always back and forth here as well. And then you have Louisa, who married a Campbell, you know, from Polk family fame as well.
Right.
And then she ended up in Missouri. So it was, like when I was first researching, it was the slaves that sort of took me out there, because I knew that Gilbert's mother had went to Missouri, and Gilbert had ended up going to Arkansas. And so you go into those sort of collections, looking, or those areas, and you try to find information within those areas, just like we have information at our county archives. And so there was a collection in Missouri that they had a minimal amount of it online, but they were good things online. Letters, which are my favorite. I prefer those over deeds. You like growing the property is good, but growing the humans I love. And so we asked if we could go out to Missouri. So we need this collection, and it was massive. And it would have just been incredible it would have been impossible to have somebody else do all that for us. So you let Jenny and I go to Missouri, and this collection was insane. They had so many things, and they weren't things that we knew existed before. They had a picture of Nancy.
Then a picture of Nat without a beard.
Yeah, a picture of Nat without
Now,
a beard.
I have to say, editorial commentary here, one of the reasons that we didn't know some of this existed was because when we took over management of Rippa Villa, the former manager, the former nonprofit, had cleaned the place out. They took everything. So we were really starting from scratch. Now, I'm pretty sure they hadn't really tapped into any of this, but I know they had the photo of Nat without the beard because I found something later on. I was like, you know what? Doggone it. But it made it more fun because
and we had the original. And you know what? I'm so grateful. At first, I was sad that we didn't have any of that research, but I'm grateful because we're starting from scratch. We're doing it ourselves. We know it's done right. And we know that we've done our due diligence to make sure that all the facts are correct.
And we also found out, didn't we, that Nat and Louisa were always very, very close.
Yeah, I think they were probably the closest out of all the siblings.
Right.
It appears to me.
Yeah, so we won't discuss this, but so I'll insert it now. That letter we found where Nat wrote about Louisa's death. Oh my goodness, because she died. Yeah, and he talks about her last breath was like...
And he was going up to take care of her.
Her last breath was like when someone blows out a candle. I mean, it was just incredible. And they were... That was 1889. I mean, they were, I think, very close for 70 years of their lives. But what was it about the Campbells? Because this is probably... I'll admit right now, it is the most ridiculous part of what I've been working on now for months, which is the Campbell story opened up a whole nother world. And I think that's when I realized this book was not going to be just about Nat Chairs and Susan Chairs and the enslaved here and Rippa Villa, which early on, what did we find? Rippa Villa wasn't one word. You know, it was 2 words, and we caught all shades of hell from people about that. Like, why are you changing the name? And I was like, we're only changing it back to what it was in the 1800s. And I mean, you found scads of letters where Nat was clearly writing.
I don't know that I saw anywhere it was one.
Yeah, I never saw a single one where it was a single word. It was always 2 words. Anyways, the Campbell story.
The thing about the Campbells... and everyone else, because I want to get into this. You just touched on something. What I love about all the different facets of the family that are coming together is they're all so different. But what it makes you understand is they're all so different, but they're also connected. And it makes you understand that, like, when we live our lives, we're not just living, it's not just me living my life. It's like, I know all of you guys, so you're all part of my world. And they had these people that they're friends. Mm-hmm. Like, Robert McLemore was his best man, who was, you know, the one, his brother owned Harvey McLemore. So there are all these connections, and I love that because it creates a community, and communities are my favorite things. But in this case, it was this family that they were branching out, and then they had their own communities, but all these people were connected. Like, Nat went to Missouri, right? And he lived in Missouri. And then, so I think one of the things that sort of exploded...
Let's talk about that just for a second. Okay. Because we couldn't find Nat in 1840.
Yeah.
Couldn't find him anywhere.
Yeah, he wasn't on the
And then you found him, well... because his name's not on the census, but we found a white male that matches, and then later found an account.
It's because in that Campbell collection in Missouri.
Right, that she said that Nat had lived there for a number of years.
That her uncle had lived with her for a number of years, and with the age that she said that she was when he came back, under 5, you know it has to be that 1840. He has to be the one that's on that census.
Okay, so let's go back to the Campbell. So Louisa married John Campbell.
Yes.
John died early, tuberculosis, 1852. So Louisa was a widow for a number of years before the war, but they have a whole gaggle of kids. So we had started with one of the daughters who had ended up living in Tennessee for a while because she seems to have been just a kind of a hellion. And
see, those are my favorite kind of stories. You say she's a hellion, but the story is that Nat and his mother, and there's so many things about that one story. Think of everything this one story that Rush tells, like later in life. Think of everything that it does for us.
Well, she admitted she was a hellion.
Yeah, she admitted she was a hellion, that she couldn't be controlled by her mother. But remember who she mentions came to Missouri with Sarah and Nat?
Yes.
Who? Mary Ann.
Right.
So we knew that
Gilbert's mother.
Gilbert's mother. So, and that's right at the time they was like, oh my gosh, did she get... You know.
Well, I already wrote this. I believe that Nat got Mary Ann pregnant in Missouri.
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but that gives them proximity. And
which I shouldn't laugh about this, which is probably why Nat got hauled back home. because the family, there were several members of the family who knew about it, but we're already getting sidetracked from the Campbells.
But you have that. But then what else she said in the story that I think adds like this human element, and I know you wrote about it, was when they left and Rush realized that they were taking her away because her mother couldn't control her, and her grandma was like, I'm gonna help you out. I'm gonna take one of your kids so that you can, only have the others to take care of. And they have Rush in the wagon, and she's screaming, and Nat pulls the wagon over. And, she said, boxed my ears and yelled at me. And I'm thinking, that's probably spanking, right? Boxing her ears. But it scared her so much she didn't talk for...
He probably smacked her on the side of the head, and then he spanked her. I mean, who knows? But if she was screaming in the wagon, when Nat was probably like, I guess he made a long trip, and you're not going to scream the whole way back to Tennessee.
Like, don't make me pull this wagon over. And then she did, and he pulled it over. And
so the war starts.
Yes.
Okay, so we were looking at a family. 4 of them predominantly live in Tennessee. Even though Nancy spends time in Arkansas, that's only because of her husband. Yes, exactly. All right, so then you have Louisa, who lives in Missouri. Mm-hmm. Thomas lives in Mississippi. Thomas died right before the war. So for a while, I put Thomas's story away, and then I went back to it. But I was looking at who served as a Confederate soldier. And of course, at Rippa Villa, people have been told for years about Nat Chares' service in the Confederacy. And it's an interesting story, and obviously you would tell that here. But this family, to your point about how they're all connected, all suffered immeasurable loss because of the war. So Louisa had 4 sons who served in the Confederate Army. And we're going to not cover really 2 of them. Leonidas, who is the second oldest son, was involved in a terrible incident in the Trans-Mississippi, the Battle of Poison Springs, where dozens and dozens of USCT soldiers, black soldiers, were killed by the Confederates. I don't know what Leonidas' involvement, but it was the oldest son, Jack, that we found all those letters that were written from this place called Valley Home, which is in Yazoo County, Mississippi.
And those are all from the Campbell collection.
Right. So let me just set the table. So Jack was sent to Yazoo County,
as a teenager,
which was
right?
it was a jungle, sent there by his father when he was 18 years old, and put in charge of hundreds of acres of land, almost 50 slaves. I mean, I wrote, this man was as conditioned as anybody. He didn't have any other choice in life other than to be a slave-owning planter, because his dad dropped him off down there. And
how old was he?
He was 18 in the 1850 census. And then when the war starts, he's among these men who don't enlist right away, but he does join. He ends up in the 30th Mississippi. He and another brother, Thomas, fought at the Battle of Stones River, and I now know they were both on the battlefield within probably a mile from one another. Their units had just suffered ungodly casualties. The other brother, Thomas, was in the 17th Tennessee, and then Jack died during the war because I think he was sick before the war, and he got tuberculosis just like his father. Thomas was captured at Chickamauga, died in a POW camp. Then there's the other brother, Sammy, who was fighting in the Trans-Mississippi. So Louisa lost 2 sons. Then, on the other side, Thomas, he's dead, but his widow, Harriet, she had a bunch of sons who went off, and at least 2 who fought in the Confederate Army. And we found out one of those died at Nancy's house in Columbia. That was William.
Yep. He's buried at the cemetery.
He's buried at Rose Hill Cemetery in Columbia with his aunt and her husband. And so I started to look at... So then that's when I went all the way back and decided these people weren't just connected. Their whole world was connected. So I started to interlace how this is the Chares and the Campbells, but I mean Louisa's at Chares, how their worlds weren't just connected via blood. Their worlds weren't connected just via slavery or money. Their whole world was connected because of what was happening in the country. And you can see how Tennessee is the frontier. It's early American history. It's early settlement. But it's that it's that thing nobody can get away from in the South, and something nobody can get away from politically, and it's slavery. And it's the expansion of it, that it goes into Missouri, that it goes into Mississippi. And I think between the Chair's siblings, I think they may have owned 700 people. If you start adding it all up, I shouldn't say it's unbelievable, but it's almost staggering. And they were very aware of the world that they lived in. And then what we found in addition on the war side, is this incredible story of USCTs. And we found slaves in connected to every one of these people who are doing what? Well, they're becoming free, and some of it's pretty quick, some of it's more gradual, but all of these young men who escape. So let's talk a little bit about the slaves, the young enslaved men who were here who escaped. Talk about a few of them, not named Gilbert, because of course Gilbert is in another place by 1861 and 2.
Well, we know a lot of them probably didn't escape from Rippa Villa because they had been sent away beforehand, but
to where?
To Vale Mills, most likely,
which
down
is in
Pulaski. Nat had one after Fort Donelston, probably after he came home, and sometime after that had sent a lot of his slaves south because the U.S. Army was getting closer, and it was a way. It wasn't altruistic. It was a way to protect his investment.
And everybody's doing it. John McGavick does that at Carnton.
Yeah, John McGavick does the same thing at Carnton. So he sent his slaves down to a couple family members' homes and to a couple friends' home, business associates he sent down there. And so, like, Jonas was sent down there, and he actually was down there at Obadiah Jones's house, Obie Jones's house, and the U.S. Army came because Jonas was sent to guard the mules, because Nat also sent his mules south to keep him out of the range of the U.S. Army. And when the U.S. Army found him, they took Jonas and the mules, and Jonas joined the USCT after that. And so Jonas came back here to Murray County afterwards, and then ended up, I think, Hickman County. He married a Haddocks, remember Julia Haddocks? Mm-hmm. But his parents... Jonas's parents were Henry and Martha, who were owned by daddy chairs.
We could do an episode just on the Haddock story.
I know. I was hoping we would talk more about the Haddocks because I love the Haddocks. That story is insane. But then we have Millie, who had to send off two of her sons, Joshua and Philip. So Joshua and Philip, and poor Philip is up in Nashville. And the story is that he was trying to steal a chicken and he got shot by a local farmer.
They were doing guard duty on the railroad west of Nashville, and he got killed. But his brother, so Joshua, ends up...
Yes, Joshua.
Philip got killed. And Joshua then fought at the Battle of Nashville and was part of the group that attacked
a lot of the guys,
Compton Hill.
Peach
Orchard Hill.
Willie ended up there and fought in Nashville. Joshua fought in Nashville. There are quite a few. I'm not so good on the regiments, but there are a lot of them that ended up in Nashville fighting at the Battle of Nashville.
And how about Jerry, who was captured at Sulphur Trestle, which is south of here in North Alabama.
Jerry's is the saddest story.
And Jerry was among, hundreds of men. I just thought of something else that I found out. So we knew they had been sent to Mobile because the Confederate policy at that time was not to treat black troops as POWs. They treated them as slaves, so they just shipped them back to slavery. And I knew from way back when we worked on the Fuller story in Franklin that there was a guy named James Moore, who was in the same regiment, who had been shipped to Mobile. And his service records said that when the war was ending, he was rescued by the U.S. Army. And I was like, rescue? I was like, oh my God. He was actually just shipped off, used as slave labor again. And when they took Mobile at the end of the war, they found out this guy had actually been a soldier. Well, then we found out Jerry was there.
But you skipped a really good fact. After the war, James Moore lives here at Rippa Villa.
But I also found, we knew this was true, but when I was, the official records are just filled with nuggets of wonderful stuff. And I actually found a report from early 1865, Dabney Murray, who was the Confederate commander down there, and he was actually listing how many Confederate troops were there and how many slaves were there. And there's a section in the report where he actually called them Forrest's captured Negroes. And I was like, these were the guys that Forrest had captured at Sulphur Trestle and Athens, and they were actually categorized differently, which means they knew they had been soldiers, because the other ones were just slaves who'd been confiscated from nearby farms and plantations. And I was like, oh my God, that's where Jerry was. That's where James Moore was. And that these guys were, well, just treated like they'd always been, like some
I think
object.
Wesley was captured there too, and Wesley was actually one of Moses and Miriam's sons. So he was never enslaved here, but he was owned by William McKissick. He escaped and then died of sickness right after.
So because we can't go on endlessly about
But we
this.
have to tell Jerry's story about when he was in prison because it's so terribly sad and horrible. He was he was sick. He had some sort of pneumonia, sickness, bronchial, and they were doing labors. And there are 2 or 3 witness accounts, and plus Jerry's witness account, that he fell behind in the line when everybody was moving, and a Confederate guard hit him with his gun and then stabbed him in the arm. Bayoneted him in the. This was a teenage boy. And he suffered the rest of his life because of it. And I just think, oh my God, just the horribleness of treating another human being that way.
Well, this leads into where I think we should probably try and tie this up, because you had found a letter in that collection about Nat Chairs was somewhere in Arkansas just a few years after the war, and he was complaining to his sister, Nancy, about a group of men, black men, who were not working. And essentially, I think they were trying to be paid a little bit
More.
They wanted higher wages.
Fairly.
And Nat was complaining about this is what they were doing, and he said it's too bad we can't turn their shirt tails against them or use leather straps.
They're waiting for something better to come up. Too
Right.
bad it can't be their shirt straps.
Right. Shirt tails or leather straps. And you had said it makes me not like him. And I said, I don't think it's really about that.
It makes me feel that way because I know Gilbert was his son and Gilbert was working there.
Right. And I know that. And I think what I'm trying to convey is, why would Nat Chairs think any differently about that situation? Because talk about conditioning. This was the world in which they were raised. And it's once you're that deep into it, it really is hard to pull yourself out of it. And that's not an excuse, that's a reality. So the reality then, I learned so much about the Ku Klux Klan. And this has been pretty recent, that, we look at the Klan often through very narrow prisms. They're either horrible monsters or they're to be defended. And the truth is probably somewhere in between all of that. But we know that the Klan was greatly impacted by 2 things, chiefly guys like William Brownlow, the governor after the war, but also the idea that A, white men were disenfranchised. If they had any connection to the Confederacy, they couldn't vote. And that in early 1867, black men got the right to vote. And the combination of those 3 things just sends people off the rails. To me now, I understand, because I'd always wondered, why did the Ku Klux Klan start in Tennessee of all places? It didn't start in Mississippi, didn't start in South Carolina. It's that Tennessee was the only state that had been in the Confederacy that actually was very progressive on civil rights. And when they gave black men the right to vote 3 years before the 15th Amendment, it just popped the heads off a lot of white people, and they just couldn't fathom it. And so the Klan is extraordinarily influential.
Well, you also have to look at the populations. Think of the populations of this county, and Williamson County specifically was primarily...
Well, Giles County, Davidson County,
Enslaved.
Shelby County.
So now you have a lot of white men that can't vote, but you have black men that can vote, and there's this fear and this anger and this resentment and this loss of power. All of those lead into the KKK. They're one of the pension applications, and this is why the pension project is so important, because it wasn't one of our guys pulling other pensions. He talks about the being targeted by the Ku Klux. He said they were trying to get as many of them out of town as they could because they just wanted them to leave the county. He said they want us to leave the county because they didn't want them voting.
Right. Well, civics lesson at the end of the episode is that Grant wins the 1868 presidential election.
Who's Grant? Just
Ulysses S. Grant, wins the election in 1868. He won Tennessee, but it wasn't easy. The only reason he won in Tennessee was because he got the black vote in Shelby County, Davidson County, and Murray County. And by 1872, things had changed in Tennessee. The Klan was gone, and black men could still vote, but white men were now allowed to vote, and they added a poll tax. And in 1872, Grant lost that election. And other than Warren G. Harding in the 1920s, he won Tennessee. Grant was the last Republican until Dwight Eisenhower to win the state of Tennessee. And it was astounding how quickly the old order reasserted itself. And so I've still got more to write, but ultimately this is going to end up with General Motors arriving. And how
That was a jump.
How well it really is. Because once the Chairs family left here, there's about 50 or 60 years where it's like everything's sort of in stasis. History seems to almost freeze. We're not really, there aren't historic sites like Rippa Villa that are open to the public. And so when General Motors comes along and really changes Murray County in a way, I think probably as profoundly as Murray County had not been changed since the American Civil War. That's what General Motors did to this area.
Yeah.
It just completely altered the landscape, literally, physically altered the landscape, but also allowed a place like Rippa Villa to open. And I think that this is a wonderful opportunity to teach people not just about this family and this site and Murray County and the state of Tennessee.
But there are connections everywhere.
And the South and the Confederacy, but what the country was going through. And I just don't think that there's any other place quite like it. There's certainly no other family. There's certainly no other family quite like the Chairs. They're very unique.
But haven't you noticed when you're going down to Mississippi or Missouri or Arkansas, it's the same family names? Because everybody was sort of going together. So like when you go to Arkansas, it's the Peters and it's the Campbells and it's the Chairs, and you're like, wow, Perkins. Perkins is everywhere, but I like that. I like in Mississippi that you see the same names like within the same communities because they're moving down there. It's like friends moving down together and each starting their own place. I think that those connections are cool. It's the same names here in Murray County, but in Mississippi and Missouri. I only got the bell once.
I know, and we could probably, do 2 or 3 other episodes on this because this is why the book will end up being 600 pages. There is so much to tell, and not just about a few people.
No, we didn't get to tell any of the scandalous stories that are in the
Well, we've already talked about Van Dorn and Gilbert. I mean, we did videos on them, but even fully fleshing out in writing the Earl Van Dorn story, I can see why nobody in the Chairs family ever talked about it, because I think they all knew what had happened, and it was disgusting on an unspeakable level.
I think also just to protect Clara and Medora. It's protection.
Sure.
Not that it's disgusting, it's also...
Well, it's disgusting, and then it's a cover-up.
Yes.
And the cover-up is because it was so awful. But in some ways, that's what they did with the war. That's what they did with the pre-war era. They just covered it up, and they tried to move on. One group of people struggling for their place in society, and the other ones wishing they could go back to the way it was. And those two things just keep banging against each other for decades.
Like Nat saying, I wish we could draw up their short tails.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the history at this site alone is 110 years. And so we've got lots to do in the years to come. Again, we'll be talking about these stories in the months to come because we'll insert pieces of them into the tours, but hopefully the book's out by the beginning of 2026, and then everybody can read about all of the wild things that were happening in Murray County and across Missouri and Mississippi and Tennessee. Anything else? Are we good? Are we all done? All right, thanks, everybody.